Redefining African Economic Strategies Amid Declining International Aid. The video features Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, WTO, discussing the shifting dynamics of international aid and the need for African nations to adopt a new economic paradigm. The central theme revolves around the reduction of USAID funding and the implications for African countries, emphasizing the need for self-reliance, investment attraction, and domestic resource mobilization. This analysis delves into the key points raised in the video, contextualizes them within the broader geopolitical and economic landscape, and evaluates the feasibility and implications of the proposed strategies.
One of the key things that is emanating is a recognition of the present very difficult geopolitical context we are in. And of course, as the head of the WTO, I'm right in the middle of it. But one thing is very clear. Africa we really need to change our mindset. Access to aid, I think we can begin to think of it as a thing of the past. We really have to focus on two things: attracting investment and mobilizing our own domestic resources. And I think that is a theme that is running through almost all the meetings here at the AU. I think African leaders are recognizing that this is a challenge, but we can also see it as an opportunity. And again, I'm glad to say that it's emerging that, look, this could be looked at as an opportunity. This morning, we had a session with the Multilateral Development Bank Association of Africa itself, along with President Mahama. One of the things we talked about is how do we better mobilize our own resources on the continent to invest in ourselves? I pointed out that we have about $250 billion worth of pension funds resources on the continent, which we need to find a way to tap. First, the pension funds need to look at their regulations to see how they change it so that they can invest more on the continent rather than investing more outside. And pension funds from South Africa is the biggest, but you have South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Morocco, Botswana, Namibia, so many countries. When you start totaling the resources, it's huge, hugely significant. 250 billion is the estimate that I have. We have these multilateral development banks like African Finance Corporation, Afrexim Bank is chairing the Association of African Multilateral Institutions. We need to capitalize them better. Instead of looking outside to see, oh, what can we get? We have our own institutions. The shareholders are the African governments. Capitalize them properly so that their balance sheet can expand. They have a combined balance sheet now of about 70 billion. But if you look at the $70 billion, but if you look at the needs we have for infrastructure alone, up to more than 200 billion a year, you can see that we need to expand the balance sheets of these organizations. We have more than 84 national development banks and financial institutions, quite apart from the multilateral. How do we mobilize them and capitalize them better so they can help us finance? In Nigeria, during the time I was finance minister, we raised a diaspora bond of $300 million that was quite successful. That's another type of instrument you can tapping our resources of our people outside, not just inside the continent. So there's so many creative and innovative ways we can raise resources. I want to end by one thing. Another theme going here at the meeting is the realization that we have to better add value and monetize our mineral resources on the continent. Almost every head of state is talking about large discoveries of lithium, manganese, copper, so many things that are needed in the manufacture of electric batteries and vehicles. They are found on this continent. The issue is, how do we attract the right investment so they add value? They don't come dig up the mine the resources and get them processed elsewhere. They have to be processed on the continent to create more jobs for us and to increase our trade. The only way we are going to be able to finance ourselves is to grow our economies, trade more, add value to our products, trade more. And at the WTO, we're trying to see what are those barriers that are preventing us. Sometimes when we add value, we can't export it the way we want. What are those barriers? And we have a unique opportunity at our 14th ministerial next year, which will be in Cameroon, for Africa to articulate those barriers and for us at the WTO to work hard to make sure that we lower them so we can have a better percentage of world trade and a better percentage of intra-Africa trade.
Dr. Okonjo-Iweala begins by acknowledging the challenging geopolitical environment, which has led to a reduction in international aid, particularly from traditional donors like the United States. She highlights that Africa must recognize this shift and adapt by moving away from a dependency mindset. The reduction in USAID funding is symbolic of a broader trend where donor countries are reassessing their foreign aid priorities, often redirecting resources to domestic issues or emerging global challenges like climate change and security. This observation is critical, as it underscores the urgency for African nations to rethink their economic strategies. Historically, many African countries have relied heavily on foreign aid to fund development projects, but this dependency has often been criticized for fostering inefficiency, corruption, and a lack of accountability. The decline in aid, while challenging, presents an opportunity for African nations to take ownership of their development agendas. A central argument in the video is the need for African countries to pivot from seeking aid to attracting investment. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala emphasizes that investment, particularly foreign direct investment, FDI, can drive sustainable economic growth by creating jobs, transferring technology, and fostering innovation. She points out that Africa has immense potential, with a young and growing population, abundant natural resources, and untapped markets. However, realizing this potential requires creating an enabling environment for investors, including stable governance, transparent regulations, and robust infrastructure. The emphasis on investment over aid aligns with global economic trends, where private capital flows have increasingly surpassed official development assistance, ODA, as a source of funding for developing countries. However, attracting investment is not without challenges. Many African countries still grapple with issues like political instability, corruption, and inadequate infrastructure, which deter investors. Addressing these challenges requires concerted efforts from governments, the private sector, and international partners. Another key theme is the importance of mobilizing domestic resources to fund development. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala highlights the significant financial resources available within Africa, such as pension funds, which are estimated to be worth $250 billion. She argues that these funds should be leveraged to finance infrastructure projects and other development initiatives, rather than being invested abroad. This is a compelling argument, as domestic resource mobilization, DRM, is increasingly recognized as a critical component of sustainable development. By tapping into local resources, African countries can reduce their reliance on external funding and ensure that development priorities are aligned with national interests. However, mobilizing domestic resources requires addressing structural issues like weak tax systems, limited financial inclusion, and regulatory barriers that prevent pension funds and other institutional investors from investing locally. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala also discusses the role of multilateral development banks, MDBs, in financing Africa's development. She notes that African MDBs, such as the African Finance Corporation and the African Export-Import Bank, have a combined balance sheet of $70 billion, which is insufficient to meet the continent's infrastructure needs, estimated at over $200 billion annually. She calls for better capitalization of these institutions to expand their lending capacity and support large-scale projects. This point highlights the importance of regional financial institutions in addressing Africa's development challenges. By strengthening MDBs, African countries can pool resources, share risks, and finance projects that individual nations might not be able to undertake alone. However, This requires political will and coordination among African governments, as well as support from international partners. A recurring theme in the video is the need for African countries to add value to their natural resources and increase their participation in global trade. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala points out that Africa is rich in minerals like lithium, manganese, and copper, which are essential for the production of electric vehicles and batteries. However, much of these resources are exported in raw form, with little value addition occurring on the continent. She argues that attracting investment in processing and manufacturing can create jobs, boost exports, and enhance economic diversification. This argument is particularly relevant in the context of the global energy transition, which is driving demand for critical minerals. By developing local processing capabilities, African countries can capture a larger share of the value chain and reduce their vulnerability to commodity price fluctuations. However, this requires significant investment in infrastructure, skills development, and technology transfer, as well as addressing trade barriers that hinder the export of value-added products. Intra-African trade and the role of the WTO. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala concludes by emphasizing the importance of intra-African trade and the role of the WTO in addressing trade barriers. She notes that Africa accounts for a small percentage of global trade and that increasing intra-regional trade can drive economic growth and integration. She also highlights the upcoming WTO Ministerial Conference in Cameroon as an opportunity for African countries to articulate their trade priorities and advocate for reforms that benefit the continent. This focus on trade is timely as the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, seeks to create a single market for goods and services across the continent. By reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers, the AFCFTA has the potential to boost intra-African trade and stimulate economic growth. However, realizing this potential requires addressing challenges like inadequate infrastructure, regulatory harmonization, and capacity constraints. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's arguments are well articulated and grounded in the realities of Africa's economic landscape. Her emphasis on self-reliance, investment, and trade reflects a pragmatic approach to development that aligns with global trends and best practices. However, several challenges and considerations must be addressed to translate these ideas into actionable outcomes. One of the key challenges facing African countries is weak governance and institutional capacity. Attracting investment, mobilizing domestic resources, and implementing large-scale projects require strong institutions, transparent governance, and effective regulatory frameworks. Without addressing these issues, the proposed strategies may struggle to gain traction. Africa's infrastructure deficit remains a significant barrier to economic development. Inadequate transportation, energy, and digital infrastructure increases the cost of doing business and limits the continent's ability to compete in global markets. Addressing this deficit requires substantial investment, which may be difficult to mobilize given competing priorities and limited fiscal space. The global economic environment is characterized by uncertainty, with rising inflation, geopolitical tensions, and the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. These factors can deter investment and complicate efforts to mobilize resources. African countries must navigate these challenges while pursuing their development agendas. While the focus on investment and trade is important, it is equally critical to ensure that growth is inclusive and benefits all segments of society. This requires addressing issues like inequality, unemployment, and poverty, which remain pervasive in many African countries. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala's remarks in the video provide a compelling vision for Africa's economic future, emphasizing self-reliance, investment, and trade as key drivers of development. Her call for a shift from aid dependency to sustainable economic strategies is both timely and relevant given the changing global landscape. However, realizing this vision requires addressing significant challenges, including governance, infrastructure, and global economic uncertainty. By leveraging its resources, strengthening institutions, and fostering regional integration, Africa can unlock its potential and chart a path towards sustainable and inclusive growth. The road ahead is challenging, but the opportunities are immense, and the time for action is now.